There's a castle in northwestern Spain whose lord supposedly died in a Castilian dungeon in 1486. Within months, a navigator with no documented past began circling the Spanish court, asking Queen Isabella of Castile for ships. Officially, these are two different men, but a stubborn group of Galician researchers thinks they're the same person, and the closer you look, the stranger the resemblance gets. This is just one of many historical mysteries that surrounds Christopher Columbus, but some historians think this one has real meat on the bone. Pedro Alvarez de Sotomayor, better known by his nickname Pedro Madruga, was one of the most feared figures in 15th century Galicia. He'd been born around 1430 in the rugged northwestern corner of Spain, a place where feudal lords still acted like petty kings, long after that arrangement had quietly faded elsewhere in Iberia. His seat of power was the great castle of Sotomayor, perched high above the river estuaries that drain into the Atlantic just south of Pontevedra. From there, he ruled a private domain with an iron grip, ran his own fleet up and down the Galician coast, and made enemies of nearly every powerful institution he encountered. He picked up the name Madruga because he liked to attack at dawn, before anyone in his target town or castle had finished their morning prayers. By every contemporary account, he was intelligent, multilingual, politically slippery, and ruthless. He spoke Galician and Portuguese natively, and he picked up Castilian Spanish out of political necessity. He also had a working knowledge of Latin from his years at the Portuguese court, where he'd been raised after his father's death. He married well, fathered legitimate and illegitimate children across two kingdoms, and switched political allegiances whenever it suited his survival. By 1485, though, his luck had run out, and he'd been excommunicated by the Archbishop of Santiago. To make matters worse, his fortresses had been demolished by his rivals, and his alliance with the Portuguese king had collapsed. He was eventually captured, handed over to the Catholic monarchs, and held in Alba de Tormes, and the official record says he passed away there in 1486 of illness. The peculiar part is that no body was ever produced, and his family tomb in Galicia, when it was opened by his own descendants in later centuries, was reportedly found to be empty. Now hold that thought and consider the man we know as Christopher Columbus. The standard narrative places his birth in Genoa around 1451, the son of a wool weaver named Domenico Colombo. He's supposed to have spent his early years on Mediterranean trading vessels before washing up in Portugal in 1476 after a sea battle. There he marries a Portuguese noblewoman, Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, and begins pushing his westward route around Lisbon. By 1485, he's been turned down by the Portuguese king and has crossed into Castile to start lobbying Queen Isabella. The timing is almost too convenient since Madruga is captured and supposedly dies in the same narrow window that Columbus mysteriously emerges as a serious presence at the Spanish court. And the man who shows up doesn't quite match the wool weaver's son the official story describes. Columbus writes in Castilian, sometimes in Portuguese, but no surviving document from his hand is in Italian, not even his letters to Italian bankers. His Castilian is shot through with Portuguese and Galician features, and he moves easily among Iberian aristocrats. He also seems to know naval architecture, command structure, and Atlantic currents in a way no merchant's apprentice from Italy reasonably should. He also deliberately refuses to talk about where he comes from, even when he's questioned on it. His son Hernando, who wrote the first biography of him, openly admits that his father deliberately obscured his origins. Hernando himself couldn't manage to find a single relative when he traveled to Genoa to look. For a man who'd later be celebrated as the Admiral of the Ocean, that's a strange silence, at least according to the proponents of this theory. The case for the swap took serious shape in 1992 when a Galician engineer published a thick, footnoted volume arguing that Columbus and Madruga were the same man. He wasn't the first to suggest a Galician origin, since earlier scholars had already flagged the language clues, but he was the first to point directly at the missing outlaw nobleman. That generation of researchers assembled an unsettling pile of correspondences and other evidence which they used to try to sway the historical establishment. And I should probably mention here that the researchers generally came from outside academia, which always adds significant difficulty in getting a historical theory taken seriously. Columbus's signature, the strange pyramid of Greek and Latin letters, lines up with the abbreviations a Galician nobleman of his rank would have employed. Several of the place names Columbus assigned during his first voyage, echolocations clustered tightly around the Sotomayor estate. There was a San Salvador, a Punta Lanzada, a Bayona, a Porto Santo, all place names that were common around the estate. Some contemporaries referred to his flagship not as the Santa Maria, but as La Galega, the Galician woman. However, the mainstream explanation of this is that it was done because she'd been built in a Galician shipyard by craftsmen working in a regional tradition. Then there's the matter of the men around him, which some have viewed as a sign of Galician origins. The Pinzon brothers, who actually commanded 2 of the 3 ships, came from a port that had long-standing commercial ties to the Galician maritime world. Several of the lesser sailors on the 1492 voyage have surnames that turn up repeatedly in the parish records of Pontevedra. Other officers and pilots associated with the early Indies voyages can be traced back to towns within a day's ride of Sotomayor. For a Genoese outsider, Columbus seems to have arrived with a remarkably local crew. There's also the practical question of who could have led such a voyage. The Genoese version of Columbus's life has him learning the sea on coastal merchant runs, which is poor preparation for an Atlantic crossing. Madruga, by contrast, had run a private fleet for decades. He'd commanded raids along the Galician coast, escorted shipments to Portugal, and worked the same currents and wind patterns that govern any westward push out of the Iberian Peninsula. He'd also kept active contact with the Portuguese pilots, already probing the Atlantic islands in the 1470s and 1480s. The obvious objection is the simplest one. If Madruga had survived his political collapse and reinvented himself as a navigator, why bother scrubbing the past at all? The proponents of the theory have a ready answer, and it's the part that's hardest to dismiss. Madruga had been formally excommunicated. He'd been declared a traitor by the Catholic monarchs. His own son in Galicia was still tangled in legal fights over the family titles, and any acknowledgement that the father was still alive would have collapsed those claims. If you wanted royal patronage in 1486, being the obscure son of a Genoese wool weaver was a far safer biography than being an excommunicated outlaw. There's also a strange thread in Columbus's behavior that makes more sense if you assume he had something to hide. He demanded extraordinary hereditary titles before he'd even sailed. Admiral, Viceroy, Governor of any lands he'd find, with 1/10 of all wealth in perpetuity to his heirs. Some have claimed that isn't a merchant looking for a commission, but a deposed nobleman trying to rebuild a dynasty from scratch, using a new continent as collateral. After his death, his descendants spent generations in court fights with the crown, trying to enforce those titles. Columbus also walked into the Spanish court as a supposed nobody, and somehow got an audience with the Queen within a few years. He had introductions from a powerful Spanish duke, and letters of support from churchmen who had no obvious reason to vouch for an obscure Genoese sailor. If you visit the old Sotomayor lands in Pontevedra today, you can stand in the family chapel where Pedro Madruga was supposedly laid to rest after his body was quietly returned from Castile. The crypt has reportedly been opened more than once by curious historians and by his own descendants, and each time the parish documents have recorded the same result. There's nothing whatsoever inside the tomb, no body, not a fragment of bone, no sign that anyone was ever in there. Meanwhile, in Seville, Columbus's own remains have been moved so many times, from Valladolid to Seville to Santo Domingo to Havana and back to Seville. This has created serious provenance issues, and modern genetic testing has produced contradictory and incomplete results about which bones really belong to him. Despite the intriguing parallels and historical oddities surrounding the life of Columbus, the scholarly consensus remains that he was Genoese. Perhaps the most compelling reason for this is that every Iberian person who wrote about him called him Italian or Genoese. If he had secretly been a Galician, it seems probable that someone would have wrote about that during his lifetime. This would be doubly true if he was the notorious outlaw Pedro Alvarez de Sotomayor. I also have some doubts that Queen Isabella would have worked with someone who was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. She was extremely religious by the standards of the day, an era where virtually everyone would seem extremely devout by our standards. The idea that she would have been fooled into letting her excommunicated nemesis go on a trip to the New World on her dime seems unlikely. That said, I can imagine the retort from believers in this theory would be that she knew and thought that he would fail. Another issue with the theory is the age gap between the two men, since they were close to 20 years apart. That's not a minor difference by any means, and to put this in context, this would be the difference between a 40-year-old and a 60-year-old man around 1492. I find it difficult to accept that no one would have ever commented that Columbus claimed to be 40, while he was, in fact, closing in on 60. I suppose it is theoretically possible to pull off such a charade, but I think it's exceedingly unlikely, especially in such a sun-soaked environment. Personally, I generally believe that the simplest explanation is best. Columbus came from a humble family and wanted to obscure his origins for that reason. He lived in a time where your birth largely determined your entire destiny, and Columbus clearly aspired to nobility, not mercantile success. He sailed to the New World seeking titles and positions for himself and his family in perpetuity. That said, there's enough oddities surrounding him that I'm definitely open to the idea that Columbus may not have been quite who he claimed he was. I don't believe, though, that the evidence is strong enough, at least at present, to say that he was Madruga. Somewhere on the plains of southern Britain, sometime in the middle of the 5th century, several hundred men sat down at a feast to make peace. According to the stories that survived, almost none of them walked away. The signal was a single phrase, slipped into the air in a language most of them didn't speak, and the knives were already under the table. Britain, in the 5th century, was truly in the throes of chaos, having had the light of the Roman world leave the island behind permanently. The legions had pulled out around 410, leaving behind a province that had been part of the empire for nearly 4 centuries. The Romanized aristocracy didn't vanish overnight, but the apparatus that had held the place together was gone. What replaced it was a patchwork of regional strongmen, surviving civil administrators trying to keep the Roman ways alive, and a Christian church doing its best to keep the lights on. The decades that followed are sometimes called the most poorly documented period in British history. Whole generations passed between the writers who left us anything substantive about them, at least in the surviving records. Into that vacuum walked the figure later writers would call Vortigern. Whether that was a personal name or a title meaning something close to High King or Overlord is still argued. Our best early source on the period, a sermon-like text written by the British monk Gildas about a century later, doesn't actually name him. Gildas just refers to a proud tyrant who, faced with raids from Picts in the north and Scots from the west, made a fateful decision. He invited a third group of foreigners across the sea to fight on his side. These were the Saxon mercenaries, and the cure, as it turned out, was worse than the disease. Vortigern, it would seem, decided that he had a mongoose problem, so he decided to import tigers. The full version of the story doesn't appear in writing until much later. It surfaces in a 9th century compilation, the Historia Brittonum, traditionally credited to a Welsh cleric named Nennius. It was considerably dressed up in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century History of the Kings of Britain. The basic outline runs like this. Hengist, the Saxon chieftain Vortigern had hired, was running circles around his employer. He'd already maneuvered the British king into marrying his daughter Rowena in exchange for the kingdom of Kent, and his forces had grown well beyond what Vortigern originally bargained for. To smooth things over, Hengist proposed a peace council. British nobles and Saxon leaders would meet on neutral ground, leave their weapons at the door, and break bread together. Vortigern agreed, and 300 of his most senior men rode out to the meeting. The traditional location is somewhere on Salisbury Plain, and Geoffrey of Monmouth would later tie it to the standing stones we know as Stonehenge, though that flourish is plainly his invention. What the British didn't know was that each Saxon warrior had concealed a long knife inside his boot or beneath his cloak. The two sides ate and drank and talked about borders and tribute and how the island would be run. Then Hengist, watching the room, spoke a few words of Old Saxon that the British couldn't follow. The phrase preserved by later chroniclers is something close to "take your knives," and with that, every Saxon at the feast pulled his blade and turned on the man beside him. The slaughter was supposedly nearly total, given both the element of surprise and the fact that the Saxons had potentially been deliberately spilling their drinks throughout the feasting. Only Vortigern was spared, seized on the spot and forced to ransom his own life by ceding huge tracts of land. He gave up Essex, Sussex, and the territories that would become Middlesex, depending on which version you read. That's the legend. But the trouble is that almost nothing about it holds up under serious scrutiny. The earliest writer Gildas, working perhaps 100 years after the supposed event, talks at length about Vortigern's catastrophic decision to hire Saxon mercenaries. He says nothing about a banquet or a signal phrase, and offers no targeted decapitation of the British nobility. For a man whose entire literary purpose was to catalog British calamity, that's a strange detail to leave out. Bede, writing in the early 8th century and drawing heavily on Gildas, also has no version of the feast. The story's first real appearance is in the Historia Brittonum, written more than 300 years after the event by an author writing about what he understood as a foundational disaster. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth got hold of it in the 1130s, he was building a whole national myth around the ruins of the Roman province. The betrayal at the feast had grown into a cinematic set piece, complete with named characters and a quotable signal. Folklorists have pointed out that the structure of the story isn't even original. The motif of an enemy slaughtering unarmed guests at a feast, often after a coded word or a deliberate breach of hospitality, turns up across early literature. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it makes it more likely that it was either fabricated or exaggerated to fit certain motifs. The same beat appears in Norse sagas, in Irish legend, in continental chronicles, and Greek and Roman writings. It's the kind of story that travels, attaching itself to whichever local tyrant best fits. Even then, though, it's more widely spread than that, and similar stories appear in places as far away as Mesoamerica. In my view, it's simply the sort of story that has a universal quality that people enjoy hearing, so it could even have been invented from whole cloth for this situation. However, even if the exact event didn't happen, That doesn't mean nothing happened at all, and the mid-5th century in Britain was demonstrably violent. Archaeological work at sites like Wroxeter and Caister by Norwich shows a sharp collapse in Romano-British urban life within roughly the right window. Saxon-style burials begin appearing in the east in significant numbers from the middle of the 5th century onward. Cemeteries excavated at sites like Spong Hill in Norfolk and Mucking in Essex have produced thousands of cremation urns and weapons graves of unmistakably continental origin. Gildas describes a genuine catastrophe involving real Saxons, even if his geography is muddy and his chronology is loose. Most modern historians work with a handful of possibilities to resolve this historical mystery. One is that some specific act of treachery really did occur somewhere in the early years of Saxon expansion. Perhaps it was an ambush of British negotiators, or the betrayal of a fortified site through a feast or parley, and the memory of that incident swelled over generations of retelling. Another reading is that the story is essentially literary, a Welsh attempt centuries later to explain how a Romanized British elite could have been so thoroughly displaced by Germanic newcomers. This allowed them to resist imagining that their own ancestors had been outclassed in combat, and presented the Britons as honorable and the Saxons as nefarious. A few historians have even suggested that elements of the tale were grafted onto the figure of Vortigern from an older local legend of betrayal that's now been lost. Whatever the kernel of truth, the legend itself had remarkable staying power. By the High Middle Ages, it was being repeated in Welsh poetry as a kind of national wound, a primal moment of treachery. The men at the table, if they ever sat there at all, are silent now, and the plain they met on, if it was even a plain, has been plowed and grazed and transformed beyond recognition. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just jumping in to remind you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon to take your support for my channel to the next level. Sometime in the late 790s, in a candle-lit chamber somewhere along the Rhine, the most powerful man in Western Europe slipped a wooden tablet under his pillow. He was past 50, and his hands had grown stiff with age and a lifetime spent on horseback, and he was trying, in secret, to teach himself to form letters. The man was Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, and soon to be crowned Emperor of the Romans. His biographer Einhard recorded that detail during his lifetime, and historians have been arguing about what it means ever since. Could Charlemagne read at all? And could he even write his own name? And if he couldn't, who amongst the medieval nobility could? Most of us picked up the same mental image somewhere along the way, probably from Hollywood movies or from video games. That image is the medieval lord in his drafty hall, bellowing at servants, signing land grants with a clumsy cross because his great mailed fist couldn't shape the letters of his own name. The image isn't entirely wrong, but it's misleading in nearly every important detail. It comes partly from Victorian writers who wanted a dark age to contrast against their own self-styled Enlightenment. It also comes partly from a genuine medieval distinction that's been mistranslated for generations. When a medieval cleric called someone illiteratus, he didn't mean what we mean by illiterate today. Far from it. He meant that the person couldn't read Latin with any degree of proficiency. A nobleman who could read French, German, or English completely fluently might still be classed as unlettered by the church. The only language that really counted in clerical eyes was the language of Cicero and the Vulgate, and that single linguistic trick has caused enormous confusion. Generations of historians took medieval complaints about noble illiteracy at face value. Then historians quietly began noticing that those same illiterate nobles were sending each other personal letters, drafting wills, keeping account books, and reading romances. To understand the literacy of the medieval nobility, you have to keep two ledgers at once. There's Latin literacy, which is what the church meant by the word, and there's vernacular literacy, which is what we'd recognize as ordinary reading and writing in a person's native tongue. The two grew at different rates, in different regions, and among the genders in ways that still catch modern historians off guard. In the centuries after Rome fell, Latin literacy among the Western European nobility collapsed almost completely. By the year 700, even some bishops in Frankish Gaul were struggling with the basic grammar of the Vulgate. Aristocrats handed their administration over to clerics, not because the clerics were necessarily smarter, but because they were the only people who could draft a charter in functional Latin. This is the period where the popular image of the illiterate warrior aristocracy actually fits the evidence, more or less. What we don't know, and probably never will, is how many of those same warriors could read or write in their own languages. Vernacular writing didn't yet carry prestige, and so it didn't survive in the manuscript record. A Frankish count who could scratch out a note to his wife in Old High German would have left no trace of that ability, because nobody bothered to preserve such a thing. The Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great, writing in the late 9th century, lamented that hardly a single man in England could translate a Latin letter into English. Of course, in writing that, it seems to imply that the Anglo-Saxon nobility could indeed write in their own language. Charlemagne tried to change all of this backsliding, and his reforms are still the most ambitious literacy project we can point to anywhere in medieval Europe. From the 780s onward, he ordered cathedrals and monasteries across his empire to establish schools. He demanded clean copies of liturgical texts and gathered scholars from Britain, Italy, and Spain to staff a palace school where the children of the aristocracy were drilled in Latin grammar. Perhaps most surprisingly, there's significant evidence that a number of female students were also educated there, again contradicting modern views. But more on that in a bit. The school's chief architect was the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin of York, pulled from a cathedral library in northern England, and tasked with building a curriculum almost from scratch. The results were partial. His son, Louis the Pious, was genuinely fluent in Latin. His daughters were reportedly trained alongside their brothers, which was unusual but not unheard of in earlier aristocratic households. Charlemagne himself, by contrast, was a stranger case, and we don't really know where he stood for sure. According to Einhard in the Vita Caroli Magni, the emperor understood Latin perfectly well by ear, and could speak it when he had to. But his attempts to write came late in life and never quite stuck, a fact that seemed to bother him somewhat. The detail of the wax tablets under the pillow has the ring of truth precisely because it's so unflattering. A loyal biographer doesn't invent that kind of awkwardness about his own lord, who he portrayed in a glowing light. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't survive the political collapse of the empire after 840, but its books did. Roughly 9 in every 10 surviving classical Latin texts come down to us through Carolingian copies, which gives you some sense of how much was preserved before the next slide backwards. But something began to shift in the 11th century, and by the 12th it was unmistakable. Royal and noble households across the West were producing written records in volumes that would have been unthinkable 2 centuries earlier. The English Doomsday Book of 1086, the rise of universities at Bologna and Paris, the explosion of vernacular literature in Old French all came fast, at least relatively speaking. It points to a culture that was writing itself into existence at a rate not seen since antiquity. Henry I of England, who took the throne in 1100, was nicknamed Beauclerc, meaning fine scholar by chroniclers. They clearly thought it remarkable that an English king should be so at home around books and scholarship generally. How much of this filtered into the actual reading skills of the nobility is harder to pin down with confidence. Royal and ducal courts certainly employed clerks to do the heavy lifting of formal documentation, but a growing body of evidence suggests that by the late 12th century, a noticeable fraction of Western European nobles could read fluently in at least one vernacular language. A meaningful minority could also handle Latin by that time, and some of them could do it at a very high level. After all, this was the time in which it became both prestigious and trendy for nobles to send sons off to university. Women, oddly enough, come out of this picture rather well, which may contradict some preconceived notions about the medieval world. Noble girls were often educated as carefully as their brothers, partly because they were expected to manage estates during their husbands' long absences on crusade or campaigns. An intelligent and well-educated noblewoman could vastly improve her income derived from her husband's estates, which in turn increased her prospects for a good marriage. Lower status nobles could marry up and secure more politically useful alliances with a well-educated daughter than with one who didn't know her letters. The patronage of vernacular Romance literature in the 12th century was also overwhelmingly female. The correspondence of figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her descendants makes it clear we're dealing with genuine readers, not just rich patrons seeking to farm prestige. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the picture is much clearer with respect to noble literacy. Most Western European nobles of any real standing could read their own language with reasonable fluency, and a substantial minority were comfortable in Latin as well. They were also picking up other vernacular languages as well, with Italian and French being of particular interest. Other languages such as German or English were also fairly commonly picked up, though to a substantially lesser degree. The really striking development in this period isn't noble literacy itself, but the spread of literacy into the layers just below the nobility. Merchants, urban craftsmen, and even some of the more prosperous peasants begin to leave behind enough written evidence to suggest that something close to a reading public was forming. The invention of mechanical printing in the 1450s didn't create this audience. It found one already waiting and made these texts much more affordable. In the spring of 500 BC, a Greek sailor leaving the eastern shore of the Black Sea could have kept going west for 90 straight days. Every time he stopped for water, he'd have found someone who spoke his language. These people didn't share a king or an army, and they didn't have a single agreed-upon name for themselves, though we know them today all as Greeks. No one alive in 500 BC, Greek or otherwise, could have told you with any honesty how many of them there were. And today, with modern estimates, that number is quite shocking. Here's the first thing that makes the question hard. There was no unified Greek state in the year 500 BC. What there was instead was a network, hundreds or thousands of independent city-states scattered across roughly 4,000 miles of coastline. These settlements stretched from the eastern edge of the Black Sea to the southern coast of what's now France. Each one minted its own coins, fielded its own soldiers, worshipped its own variations of the gods, and kept its own records. There was no central census, and the very concept of Greekness was something the Greeks themselves were still working out. They tended to define it negatively. You were Greek because you weren't a barbarian, which meant you weren't someone whose language sounded to Greek ears like nonsense syllables. Modern scholars have spent the better part of 2 centuries trying to put a number on it anyway. The methods researchers use to estimate ancient populations sound borderline reckless until you understand them. There's one method which works backwards from the physical footprint of a city. This includes the area inside its walls, the density of housing remains, and the number of rural farmsteads identified in its hinterland. Then it applies modern comparisons from pre-industrial Mediterranean villages to roughly sketch out how many people would have actually lived there. There's the army size method, which uses surviving military records and works out the civilian population that would have been needed to field a given force. The problem with this, though, is that ancient writers tended to greatly exaggerate the size of armies. Modern scholars have pared down these numbers, but there's no real science behind these modern historical estimates either. Then there's the grain supply method, which calculates wheat consumption implied by surviving trade records and divides by the average ancient appetite. Each method has problems and each gives different numbers, but when you stack them together, they start to converge. These convergent estimates are also pretty recent, and the first major attempt to count the Greeks of the ancient world was published in 1886 by a German classicist. For the better part of a century after that, the working consensus tended to lowball things substantially. Mainland Greece was once routinely estimated at well under 2 million people for the early 5th century, and the wider Greek world rarely above 5 million in total. The current estimates are a great deal larger simply because our understanding of the archaeology is better. For mainland Greece in 500 BC, the convergent estimate falls somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people. Athens itself, before the explosive growth of the 5th century, sat at perhaps 140,000, including its rural hinterland. Sparta proper was tiny, maybe 40,000 citizens at the absolute outside, though it controlled a helot population. These were the dispossessed population of Laconia and Messenia, and they may have been 6 or 7 times that number. Corinth, the wealthiest trading city of the era, hovered somewhere around 70,000. Thebes, the dominant power in Boeotia, sat at maybe 60,000, including its surrounding villages, and Argos in the northeastern Peloponnese was probably similar. The Aegean Islands collectively held perhaps another 400,000 to 500,000 Greek speakers between them. But here's the thing, while this was the heartland of the Greek world, the mainland was just the beginning. By 500 BC, the eastern coast of the Aegean, what's now western Turkey, had been densely Greek for nearly 4 centuries. The Ionian cities of Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna were among the wealthiest places in the entire Greek-speaking world, and Miletus alone had almost 100,000 people. Miletus had also, by some ancient accounts, founded between 60 and 90 daughter colonies around the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara during the 7th and 6th centuries. The combined Greek population of coastal Asia Minor in 500 BC is now generally estimated at somewhere over 1 million. Within 5 years of our snapshot date, almost all of these cities would rise against Persian rule in what historians call the Ionian Revolt. The numbers they fielded, tens of thousands of hoplites and oarsmen drawn from a relatively narrow coastal strip, back up the higher estimates. Sicily and southern Italy, the region the Romans would later call Magna Graecia, had been receiving waves of Greek colonists for 2.5 centuries by this point. Syracuse was already one of the largest Greek cities anywhere on Earth, and Akragas, on the south coast of Sicily, was nearly as wealthy. The combined Greek population of the western colonies in 500 BC was probably between 1 and 1.5 million. That's a Greek-speaking civilization, equivalent in size to roughly half of mainland Greece, planted in territory that had been inhabited a generation or two earlier by Italic peoples. These cities tended to assimilate the native populations of the surrounding lands quite quickly, which swelled the number of people considered Greeks even further. After all, it's important to remember that to be a Greek was, largely speaking, to not be a barbarian, and a barbarian was someone who didn't speak Greek at a native level. The wealthiest of these Western Greek cities were almost impossible to distinguish from their eastern cousins in the mainland. Syracuse was routinely considered to be one of the foundational pillars of Greek civilization, despite being located a fair distance from the heartland itself. Sybaris, on the instep of the Italian boot, had been famous across the Greek world for its luxury before it was sacked and erased by its rival Croton in 510 BC. Croton itself produced a generation of Olympic champions and was still a major regional power in 500 BC. Tarentum, founded by Spartan colonists in the late 8th century, dominated the heel of Italy and held perhaps 50,000 people. The strange thing isn't that these cities existed at all. It's that they thought of themselves as part of the same cultural world as Athens or Miletus, half a sea away. Then there are the further frontiers. Cyrene and its sister cities along the North African coast had been founded by colonists from the island of Thera in the 7th century. By 500 BC, they likely held something like 100,000 Greek speakers, with a much larger surrounding Libyan population. Cyrene itself controlled a confederation of 5 smaller coastal cities, known later as the Pentapolis, and exported silphium. This is a now extinct medicinal plant that was worth roughly its weight in silver to Greek and later Roman buyers. Egypt, meanwhile, had its own Greek population centered on the trading port of Naucratis in the Nile Delta. This was a city granted to a consortium of Greek colonies as a privileged trading hub in the 7th century and probably holding around 10,000 permanent Greek residents. The Black Sea coast had been drawing settlers from Miletus and elsewhere for 2 centuries, and the combined Greek population there was probably around 200,000. The grain produced on the steppes behind these Pontic Greek cities was already starting to feed the larger cities of the Aegean. This was the beginning of a trade route that would in time become the lifeline of classical Athens. Massalia was one of the farthest flung colonies, founded by Phocene refugees around 600 BC on the southern coast of what's now France. It had perhaps 30,000 inhabitants and was already spawning sub-colonies of its own in what is present-day Spain. Add everything together, and the estimates converge on a number somewhere between 5 and 7 million Greek speakers on the planet in 500 BC. Interestingly, roughly half of them were living outside the Greek mainland. There's also a complication that any honest count has to mention. A significant fraction of the population living inside Greek cities in 500 BC wasn't ethnically or linguistically Greek at all. Many people had been brought in from Thrace, Anatolia, the Black Sea region, and the Balkans. Modern estimates put the unfree share of Athens at perhaps a quarter to a third of the total population during this period. Whether those people should be counted as part of the Greek world depends on what kind of question you're asking. However, most evidence suggests that over the generations, they became increasingly acclimatized to Greek culture. To put the Greeks in context, consider what was happening on the other side of the Aegean. The Persian Empire under Darius I, in 500 BC, was the largest political entity that had ever existed on Earth at that time. It stretched from the Indus Valley to the borders of Macedonia, from the deserts of southern Egypt to the steppes north of the Caspian Sea. Modern estimates of its total population vary widely, but a defensible middle figure is around 17 million people, with some serious scholars pushing the number significantly higher. But here's the thing. Of those 17 million, the actual ethnic Persians probably numbered no more than 2 or 3 million. The rest were Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Bactrians, Arameans, Phoenicians, and dozens of other peoples who'd been brought under Persian rule. Unlike the Greeks, for the Persians, being a native-born Persian speaker didn't virtually automatically render you a Persian, which made it harder to bolster those core numbers. The Greek-speaking world taken as a whole was therefore substantially larger than the ethnic Persian population that actually ruled this enormous empire. That's a piece of context the Persians themselves seem to have understood. It also helps explain why Darius and his son Xerxes took the Greek question so seriously over the decades that followed. They understood the danger that the presently fractured Greeks represented, and that a unifier could pose a massive threat to the Persian Empire. Within 20 years of our snapshot date, Xerxes would march an army across the Hellespont to attack mainland Greece that some ancient counts put at over 1 million men. Modern estimates of the actual force range between 100 and 200,000 soldiers and sailors, drawn from satrapies as distant as Bactria and Egypt. Either way, it was almost certainly the largest army that had ever been assembled in the ancient world up to that point. The Greeks it was sent to attack, even though they outnumbered the ethnic Persians overall, were small, fractious, and famously bad at cooperating with each other. But I think this population context is interesting because it really does hammer home why the Persians saw the Greeks as such a massive potential threat. This is especially true when you consider the rate at which the Greeks were colonizing absolutely everything around the rim of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The way the Persians ran the Greeks they already had under their thumb is also worth a look. The Ionian cities of Asia Minor had been brought under Persian control during the conquests of Cyrus in the 540s. Darius governed them through local tyrants who paid tribute and supplied ships, and the system was profitable enough that for half a century it more or less worked. The Greeks weren't the only seafaring people in the Mediterranean in 500 BC, and if you're familiar with the period, you also already know they weren't the best either. That title goes to the Phoenicians, based in the cities of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad on the coast of modern Lebanon. They had been the dominant traders of the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, before the Greeks began their colonial expansion. In fact, they were such expert navigators that one of their colonies, Carthage, would send expeditions as far as Western Africa. There, Hanno the Navigator would famously have an encounter with gorillas, or perhaps chimpanzees. The Phoenicians had given the Greeks the alphabet sometime in the 8th century, taught them celestial navigation, and largely shaped early Greek shipbuilding. By 500 BC, however, the Phoenician homeland had been swallowed by the Persian Empire, taxed heavily, and required to supply the bulk of the Persian fleet. The political and demographic momentum of the Phoenician world had shifted west, to the Phoenician daughter city of Carthage, on the coast of modern Tunisia. By 500 BC, it was already a regional power in its own right, and would soon clash directly with the Greek colonies of Sicily. The total Phoenician-speaking population in 500 BC is harder to pin down than the Greek figure. This is partly because the Carthaginians wrote less down than their Greek rivals, and partly because much of what they did write was destroyed when the Romans flattened Carthage in 146 BC. The Romans deliberately destroyed their entire cultural heritage, keeping only a handful of texts on farming and seafaring, which they deemed economically useful. The best modern estimates put the Phoenician homeland population at perhaps 500,000 in 500 BC. Carthage and its growing western network of colonies added maybe another 500,000 on top of that. The total Phoenician civilization, in other words, was probably around 1 million people, roughly 1/5 to 1/7 the size of the Greek world. The Italian peninsula in 500 BC was a complicated patchwork that was still comparatively underdeveloped at the time, with one major exception. The Etruscans, at the peak of their power and controlling territory from the Po Valley down to the Bay of Naples, probably accounted for around 1.5 million people. Their 12-city league was arguably the wealthiest non-Greek civilization in the Western Mediterranean, trading metals and wine north into Gaul and south to the Phoenicians of Carthage. Etruscan workshops produced bronze and ceramic goods that were prized as far as the Greek mainland. That said, on a per capita basis, Carthage was likely far better off civilizationally than the Etruscans. The Latin League, including Rome itself, may have totaled 300,000 to 400,000 at this point. Rome was still a minor city of perhaps 30,000, only a few years removed from the expulsion of its last king, and still well within the orbit of its larger Etruscan neighbors. The Samnites, Oscans, and other inland Italic peoples added perhaps another million. The total Italic-speaking population came out to somewhere around 3 million, though large pockets of southern Italy had already been culturally Hellenized. Egypt, under Persian rule since 525 BC, held probably 3 to 3.5 million people in 500 BC. This was an extraordinary density for the ancient world that owed entirely to the agricultural productivity of the Nile flood plain. Egypt was, individually, larger than the mainland Greek population, by a comfortable margin. But Egypt was also a single political and ethnic bloc, while the Greek world was a 1,000-piece mosaic stretched across 4,000 miles of coastline. Then there's the rest of what the ancient Greeks called Asia Minor, or what we now know as Anatolia, roughly modern-day Turkey. The Lydians, whose former kingdom Cyrus the Great had swallowed in 547 BC, still numbered somewhere over 1 million in 500 BC. Their wealth was famous in the Greek world since the days of King Croesus a generation earlier. The Carians and Lycians along the southern coast of Anatolia, the Phrygians of the central plateau, and the Cappadocians further east, each accounted for a few 100,000 more. Taken together, the non-Greek peoples of Anatolia probably outnumbered the Greeks of Asia Minor by something like 2 to 1. Many of these non-Greek people would, in time, come to view themselves as Greeks, in the centuries following the conquests of Alexander the Great. East of them, the heartland of Mesopotamia still held probably 4 to 5 million people, the densest settled landscape in the entire Persian Empire. The Thracians north of Greece are usually estimated at around 1 million, and the Illyrians of the eastern Adriatic, perhaps half that. The Celts expanded rapidly across Central Europe by 500 BC, but were only just beginning to touch the Mediterranean directly. They contributed only marginally to the Western Mediterranean's demographic picture at this date, though that would soon change. The Iberians of the southern Spanish coast, partly Hellenized through contact with Greek and Phoenician traders, may have numbered around 1 million across the entire peninsula. North and east of the Black Sea, the Scythian Confederation, semi-nomadic horsemen ranging across the steppe from the Danube to the Volga, are more difficult to estimate. They probably totaled somewhere between 1 and 2 million, but the usual methods of estimating population don't work well with people who aren't fully settled. Still, they did engage in significant agriculture, and they supplied the grain and other goods that fueled the Pontic Greek trade. As an interesting aside, they would also be the last historically attested people that the Greeks claimed you would encounter on the way to Hyperborea. Lay these figures side by side, and the Greek world was actually the largest civilization in the Mediterranean basin in 500 BC. While the Persian Empire dwarfed it in raw numbers, this was a multi-ethnic empire with very few actual Persians, at least comparatively. Egypt rivaled mainland Greece in concentrated density, but the Egyptians didn't branch out and settle other lands like the Greeks did, instead preferring the comfort of the Nile. What was distinctive about the Greeks was their wide distribution, unmatched by any other group in the region. There were Greek speakers on 3 continents, separated by hundreds of miles of salt water. They could still understand each other when they spoke, and still send athletes to compete every 4 years at the same festival in a small valley in the western Peloponnese. In the end, there were 5 to 7 million Greek people in 500 BC, and over the next centuries, Hellenization would produce millions more. The entire world population in 500 BC was about 100 million people total, which made Greeks perhaps the most populous people in the world. At the highest estimate, this means that 7% of the entire world was Greek at that time. The only other group who could compare were the Sinitic people, who would eventually be known as the Han Chinese, though they were less unified than they would be a few centuries later. Today, for reference, We've got about 8 billion people on the planet, and using the most broad definition of Greek, ethnic Greeks form about 0.2% of the planet. A Scottish gardener walks into the Wuyi Mountains in 1848 wearing the wrong clothes, speaking the wrong language, and carrying a forged identity stitched together out of rumors. He's there to commit one of the largest acts of corporate theft in human history, to lift an entire industry plant by plant from a country that's guarded it for centuries. He's doing it all while he's dressed up in a Chinese outfit, convincing the locals that he's from beyond the Great Wall of China, where people look a bit different. The strangest part isn't that he tried, it's that he succeeded, and that almost nobody outside the tea trade today remembers his name. Robert Fortune wasn't anyone's first pick for an international intelligence operation. He was born on the 16th of September 1812 in a tiny Berwickshire farming hamlet. He served a gardening apprenticeship locally, worked at Morden House south of Edinburgh, and eventually earned a steady position at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. This was about as ambitious as a man in his trade could reasonably aim at the time, or so most people thought. In 1840, he and his family moved to London to take a job with the Horticultural Society at its garden in Chiswick. It was a respectable post, but a long way from anything resembling international corporate espionage. What changed his life was a conflict, and the First Opium War ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. This forced China to cede Hong Kong, pay a heavy indemnity, and open 5 new treaty ports to foreign merchants. The settlement shifted the regional balance of power almost overnight. The Horticultural Society saw the opportunity and, in the early spring of 1843, sent Fortune to China on a 3-year plant collection trip. He arrived in Hong Kong that July after a 4-month sea voyage, and he spent the next 3 years exploring the regions a European could now legally reach. These were places like Guangdong, Fujian, and Yunnan, and he was collecting ornamental flowers and taking careful notes. He was, for the moment, exactly what he seemed, a British gardening expert, on a trip to acquire and document plants that had been unknown in Europe. When Fortune sailed back to England in 1846, he probably thought his China days were over. He published a book about his travels in 1847, settled into his new role as curator of the Chelsea Physic Garden, and seemed headed for a quiet horticultural career. But behind the scenes, an enormous problem was building inside one of the largest commercial enterprises in human history. For more than a century, the British East India Company had effectively held a monopoly on tea coming into Britain. That monopoly had built fortunes, paid for fleets, and propped up a meaningful slice of the national books. By the mid-1840s, though, it was crumbling, and the company had lost its exclusive trade privileges. Competitors were entering the market, and every leaf of tea sold in London still had to be bought from China at whatever price China decided to set. Tea was leaving the country in colossal volumes, and silver was leaving with it. The opium trade had been one way of balancing that ledger, but it wasn't a permanent fix, and the company knew it. The only real solution was to grow tea somewhere else, and India looked obvious. The company had its own botanical garden at Saharanpur in the foothills of the Himalayas, originally run by a Scottish surgeon named John Forbes Royal. Royal and his successors had been arguing for years that tea could be cultivated on British-controlled land if only the right plants and the right knowledge could be obtained. A native Assam tea variety had already been identified in northeast India, but the problem was it hadn't been bred over millennia for the desired taste. It was the prestigious Chinese strains, with their delicate flavor and millennia of refinement behind them, that the company really wanted. As it would turn out, many of those flavors were actually a result of the Chinese methods of processing the leaves, but that wasn't known at the time. The plants and the expertise both sat inside China, behind imperial laws that forbade their export, inside an industry whose specialists had no interest in giving up their craft. The company eventually decided that if China wouldn't sell the seeds and the knowledge, the company would simply take the tea and the experts themselves. They needed a man inconspicuous enough to do it, and someone who already knew the ground a little. Fortune was approached in 1848 and accepted the contract, though he was apparently quite concerned about the danger at first. Fortune was, after all, not a great adventurer, but a man of science, and more than anything, a gardener. The terms were generous, his expenses were covered, and the company gave him a degree of operational freedom. No government department of the day would have offered an outsider. The plan called for him to enter parts of China off limits to Europeans and identify the best tea-growing regions. He was to document the entire process, recruit experienced Chinese tea workers willing to relocate, and somehow get everything back to British India. It was a profoundly illegal mission, and foreigners weren't permitted to travel more than a day's journey inland from the treaty ports. The export of tea plants and seeds without authorization was forbidden by the Qing government, which treated the trade as a matter of strategic national security and wealth. Being caught wouldn't just mean a ruined career. It could mean imprisonment, expulsion, or much worse, depending on which official happened to find him. That said, he likely wouldn't have found his head up on the chopping block due to the power imbalance between the Qing and the British, but it was a possibility. Fortune knew the only way through was a disguise, and honestly, this is how I found out about this guy to begin with. He arrived in Shanghai in the autumn of 1848 and set about transforming himself. He hired a servant who could vouch for him, paid the man to shave the front of his scalp in the style required by Qing law, and attached a long false braid, the queue, down his back. He swapped his Western clothes for loose Mandarin robes. He practiced eating with chopsticks and walked with the small, careful steps expected of a wealthy traveler. He could speak some Mandarin from his earlier trips, and what he couldn't manage he covered by claiming a far-off provincial dialect. Reportedly, he gave himself a Chinese name translating roughly as brilliant flower, which isn't too subtle, but it worked. The vast majority of the people in the area he was going to had never seen a European face. They saw an odd, slightly awkward gentleman from some distant northern town and treated him with the polite distance owed to a stranger of evidently decent means. He claimed to have been from somewhere just beyond the Great Wall, and since it was known that people from this area were different, they just accepted it. It was, on paper, a ridiculous disguise, but in practice it worked well enough. His first target was the green tea district around Songlo Mountain in what's now Anhui Province, which had supplied much of the green tea sent to Europe for generations. Reaching it meant a long, slow journey by sedan chair and riverboat with a handful of hired locals, weeks of muddy roads and narrow river towns where one wrong word could end everything. When he finally got to the tea hills, he watched everything. He watched how the leaves were picked at first light, how they were withered on bamboo trays. He observed how they were pan-fired in heavy iron woks to stop oxidation, how they were rolled by hand on hot tables, and how they were sorted by grade. Finally, he noted how they were finely packed into lead-lined chests for the long journey downriver to the coast. He noted it all in coded shorthand and rough sketches, so if any official found what he was carrying, it wouldn't look suspicious. It was here that he stumbled onto something that would later cause a significant scandal in London. The green tea being prepared for export wasn't the same product the Chinese themselves drank. Workers were dyeing it, and Fortune noticed that the men handling the export batches had bright blue stains on their fingers. When he pressed further, he found a foreman grinding gypsum and Prussian blue together with a mortar and pestle. The bluish powder was being stirred directly into the leaves to give them the bright, uniform green color that English drinkers had come to expect. The dye contained a compound built around iron and cyanide, something nobody outside the trade had reason to suspect. When Fortune later published the finding, it nudged British taste away from green tea and toward black tea, and the shift has more or less stuck. He collected seeds, took cuttings, and packed plants carefully into Wardian cases, the small portable glass and wood boxes that worked like miniature greenhouses. The cases were the secret weapon of the operation, because for decades the great frustration of plant hunting had been that almost everything died at sea. The Wardian case fixed that by trapping moisture inside a sealed environment that needed no attention during a voyage. Fortune arranged for the first shipments to be carried down to Hong Kong and then onward to Calcutta. He stayed behind and turned south, heading for an even more dangerous prize. The Wuyi Mountains in northern Fujian, known to Europeans of the day as the Bohea Hills, were the source of the famous black teas that filled British porcelain cups every afternoon. Few outsiders had ever seen the region, and reaching it meant moving through hill country where any Westerner caught poking around would, at the very least, have his journey ended quickly. Fortune got there, and he spent weeks in the area, lodging in Buddhist monasteries whose monks proved unexpectedly generous. He quietly watched the entire production cycle from morning harvest, through the long oxidation and roasting process that turned the same tea leaf into black tea instead of green. He noticed that the timing was a matter of skill rather than written rule, that the older men did it by smell and feel, and that the entire industry hung on a few thousand experienced hands. This was, for a European botanist, a revolutionary moment. Back in London, scientists had argued for years that black tea and green tea must come from two different species. The general consensus at the time was that they were almost certainly different, though a few dissenting voices argued the contrarian position. Fortune now had first-hand proof that they were in fact the same plant, processed differently. He kept his findings to himself, gathered up more seedlings, and hired several experienced Wuyi tea makers on long-term contracts. By the start of 1849, he was back in Shanghai, possessed of plants, seeds, processed samples, written notes, and a small group of skilled Chinese workers. Notably, these workers had been tricked into believing they were being recruited to a remote northern Chinese province. They were, of course, going somewhere else entirely. Getting the haul out of China nearly went wrong more than once. At one point, Fortune was traveling along the coast in a small Chinese passenger vessel with some of his most valuable plant specimens stowed below when 5 junks full of pirates closed in. The captain and other passengers, by his own later account, hid their valuables in the ballast and changed into worn clothes to look unworth robbing. Fortune himself, who was down with a severe fever at the time, dragged himself up on deck armed with a pair of pistols and a heavy rifle. He watched the lead junk fire 2 broadsides that fell short, waited until the third came within roughly 30 yards, and then opened fire. He emptied his weapons into the crowded deck of the first pirate boat, dealt with the second in the same fashion, and watched all 5 vessels break off and turn back into the coastal haze. Whether this last part was an exaggeration on his part or not isn't entirely clear, but given the generally unbelievable narrative that's been confirmed, I don't personally doubt it. That was the closest the operation came to a complete disaster, though it wasn't the only close call, and he also ran into some problems with Qing officials along the way. Once he'd reached safer water, the precious Wardian cases were transferred to larger ocean-going ships. They sailed first to Hong Kong, then onward to Calcutta, and finally up to Saharanpur in the Himalayan foothills. By 1851, the cases had reached their destination in good shape, the seedlings alive and the seeds viable, One shipment alone is recorded as containing nearly 13,000 healthy plants in the gardens after arrival. Over the course of the operation, the total number of tea plants Fortune is credited with delivering to India runs into the tens of thousands, alongside seeds in vastly greater numbers. What came next was less dramatic, but in some ways more important. The first generation of plants Fortune brought into the northwestern Indian provinces didn't do especially well. The climate there wasn't always right. The Chinese variety he'd selected wasn't ideal for the strong, dark brew British drinkers preferred, and many of the original specimens failed in the ground. He simply hadn't quite grabbed the right plants or recruited the people who produced the best processed tea. The Indian tea industry that grew up over the following decades ended up relying mostly on the local Assam variety of tea, rather than the Chinese plants Fortune had risked his life to obtain. From a strict botanical standpoint, this tea heist had partly failed, but there was, of course, much more to the story. From a strategic standpoint, it succeeded almost completely. The Chinese tea makers taught their craft to Indian workers in the gardens around Saharanpur and later in the steeper, cooler ground of Darjeeling. The processing techniques they passed on, the withering, the rolling, the careful timing of oxidation, the firing in iron pans, became the technical backbone of the Darjeeling industry. Some of the Chinese workers stayed on in India for the rest of their lives. Others eventually returned home, by which point the secret they'd carried west was no longer a secret at all. Within a generation, India was producing tea on a serious commercial scale. By the early 20th century, Chinese exports had been overtaken in the British market by Indian and Ceylonese brands. China's centuries-old monopoly was effectively finished, and a single Scottish gardener had been the practical instrument of its ending. Fortune himself wasn't finished, and he returned to China several more times through the 1850s in a less covert fashion, looking for more plants. He also traveled on to Japan, wrote 4 books, and quietly amassed a reputation as one of the most successful plant hunters of the Victorian age. He brought home hundreds of new ornamental species and lent his name to dozens of them in the botanical record. He retired to London, kept gardening, and passed away there on the 13th of April, 1880, at the age of 67. He was buried in Brompton Cemetery beneath a modest stone that doesn't mention tea at all. A man can change the economic balance between 2 empires and still end up under a plain marker, with passers-by having no idea what's underneath their feet. Fortune's name survives now mostly in the Latin labels stuck to garden plants like the Fortunaria and the Rhododendron fortunei. He pulled off one of the largest acts of botanical theft in recorded history, and till this day, almost no one remembers it. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment saying what you've learned from this video or what you like to do while you watch or listen.